Good evening and welcome to Raconteurs News. It is Tuesday night. It's our usual Tuesday night slot. Myself, Jason Holmes, and I'm riding side saddle with Andy Young. How you doing, Andy?
I'm good, Jason. How's you, mate?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you very much. Well, it is Tuesday, but it is Friday where we are because we've, due to the window of our guest, the very small window that we could get our guest in, we are pre-recording this, so it is Friday morning, but it is, to all intents and purposes, Tuesday night. And here is our guest this evening. He's not done very many interviews recently. He's been off radar. But I'd like to welcome Tony Farrell. How are you doing, Tony?
I'm fine, thank you, Jason. And Andy, thanks for having me on your show.
You're welcome, Tony.
Yeah, no problem. Well, as soon as I got a message from you that you were in town, as it were, we had to hook up, and we did that yesterday, and we've got this going on today. What you were telling me yesterday, you've got a very, very interesting position now that the Hillsborough inquest is finished, it's over with, and it appears that there's some justice is going to be forthcoming against South Yorkshire Police. I believe you think that there's still more to come out.
Almost certainly with the Hillsborough inquest finished now. We are going to see some supposed action now from the Independent Police Complaints Commission and the National Crime Agency, or for want of a better word, the National Chaos Agency. Both of those organisations can't be trusted. So although the Hillsborough Family Support Group and the supporters of the 96 have completely been exonerated with the verdict of the inquest, which is one of unlawful killing, they still haven't had any justice whatsoever because, as things stand, not a single police officer has been brought to account for the cover-up. And when I say police officer, I also should include people in positions in authority in the government at the time, and also those organisers of the stadium and those overviewing the health and safety of the stadium. So there's a range of personnel that perhaps are facing further probing. But what I wanted to, the important point I want to make, it does concern the conduct of the inquest.
Mm-hmm. I understand you did you put some evidence into the inquest, or at least give some documents and some reports to the Hillsborough Justice Campaign?
Yes, and this is I think this is vital because the $64,000 question, quite frankly, about Hillsborough is, why on earth are they still protecting Assistant Chief Constable Walter Jackson? That is it in a nutshell. Now, some people might be surprised to hear me saying that in such a forthright manner. So it does need some explanation. So let me first tell you why Jackson is so important concerning Hillsborough, because there'll be many people that may have followed the inquest that will be completely oblivious to the truth behind what happened in the police control box, because all of those that have given testimony at the inquest and before that are all lying. I can say that with great confidence. So I'm now going to impart to you, to set the scene, what happened in the police control box and why I can say that with such confidence. So here goes. Here's the story. Now, I want to take you back to 2009. I was the Principal Intelligence Analyst at South Yorkshire Police. It was probably around the 20th anniversary that this incident I'm going to describe happened. I was sat alone in the headquarters police canteen at Snig Hill at lunchtime. And along comes Andy Hymas, who was a senior press officer in the communications department. That's a reasonably high-ranking civilian post, support staff post in South Yorkshire Police. Andy came and sat by me, which was unusual. He looked as white as a ghost, actually. So I immediately, as he put his tray down to eat with me, said, "What's up, Andy?" And it was unusual for him to come and sit with me. We weren't particularly great friends or anything. Anyway, looking white as a ghost, he looks heavenward. And he said, "Oh, Tony, I've been in with the Chief Constable." And he was referring to the Chief Constable at the time, Meredith Hughes. And we've been in front of the press taking a grilling on Hillsborough. And I said, "Well, what's up? What's the big deal about that?" Now, Andy, still looking white as a ghost, looked heavenward and he says, "Oh, Tony, I was there in the stadium on the day." And then he offloaded the story to me that I'm about to tell you now. And it's important that we understand this story. I can't stress that enough. Andy explained the story, and this is my best recollection of what he told me. "Tony, I was on duty that day, and the first thing I really want to mention," he said, "was I was outside at the time, and very unusually there was a whole road full of ambulances parked outside, which was a bit odd. And then I got a phone call," he said. He got a phone call from headquarters at Snig Hill. And that phone call, this was just before kick-off, I believe, and that phone call was of a pressing and important nature. It was basically urging Andy, as the press officer, to get to the police inside the stadium and make his way straight to the police control box, which was the control box where the CCTV monitoring was taking place that overlooked the pens at the Lepping Lanes end, where there was obviously some duress and stress beginning to unfold at that time. And the reason being is that they simply weren't getting any communications from the police control box, and yet they were aware of troubles now beginning to emerge at the ground.
Right,
so they wanted information.
So the
So
problem
Andy
was
made,
they couldn't get the...
made his way towards the control box, and once at the control box door, tried to open it, it was locked. So he knocked on the door, introducing himself as the senior press officer. So that would have normally triggered an automatic entry. It didn't. He was blocked from coming inside. So he gets back on the phone to headquarters saying, "They're not letting me in, sir. What on earth do you want me to do now?" "Well, break the door down if you have to. We need to know what the heck is going on inside there because we're not getting any sense." Eventually, with Andy Hymas's perseverance, he was allowed inside the police control box where his colleagues, there were police officers on the day who were obviously making major decisions as the disaster was unfolding, were all inside. He saw everybody, right, many of them in uniform, and when he was inside, he heard something a bit odd, which was a whimpering sound. This is how he described it to me. And it wasn't coming from anybody who it was visible. And it was coming from underneath the table. So he lifted up, he ducked under the table to look underneath and saw, to his amazement, the Assistant Chief Constable, Walter Jackson. And he was gibbering like an idiot, basically. He'd lost it. And that was at a crucial time when decisions were being made about, what to do with the pressure that was exerted in the pens and the stress that was unfolding as people spilled out onto the pitch, and there was clear signs of people in trouble. And this obviously wasn't any kind of crowd invasion. This was a calamity. Now, that story that Andy told me at that time, I reflected on it over lunch with Andy. I recall saying to Andy, looking at this philosophically, was there, but I was like almost feeling sorry for this commander, Assistant Chief Constable, who had lost the plot in a moment of distress, and you wouldn't wish those circumstances on anyone. So I wasn't being judgmental at this stage. And I remember saying to Andy there, "But for the grace of God, go we," because quite frankly, what would I have done in that situation? I don't know. I'm not to judge anybody.
Sorry, Tony, Tony, did he say what the other people in the box, what were they doing? What was their demeanour like? Did he mention them, or did he just mention Walter Jackson?
He just said that it was chaotic in there, and they were obviously all aware of Walter Jackson underneath the table. So they were all purposely covering it up, and they were all deliberately keeping Andy out of the control box room initially, in order to prevent the compromised position of the assistant chief constable from being discovered. Right, so this was like a tight unit now, seemingly determined to keep the truth away from the kind of things that were going wrong in the control room, the kind of things that have never been mentioned in anybody's statement. So when Andy told me this, I reflected, but because I wasn't attuned to Hillsborough and the plight of the victims, I was never tasked to look at Hillsborough. And therefore, I always had, cases to deal with. I soon put it aside and got back to my normal duties that I was being tasked to do, and more or less forgot about it. I wasn't looking at Hillsborough at that time. It was only after I'd been dismissed for an entirely separate issue to do with speaking truth to power on the terror threat, and I was going through an employment tribunal with South Yorkshire Police, when I received a phone call from a newfound friend called David Pidcock, who had been following my employment tribunal case, who rang me to say that the Chief Constable, Meredith Hughes, was getting it in the net once again over Hillsborough, and this was concerning disclosure issues of the secret files for 30 years and some spat he was having with the Hillsborough family support group, Margaret Aspinall. So I was curious at that now, and because I'd been sacked by the organisation and was in an employment tribunal case with them, I immediately took an interest, and that's when I became more attuned to the Hillsborough plight of the victims at that point in time. And I then reflected back on the story that Andy Hymas had told me on the 20th anniversary of Hillsborough. And I then put my brain in gear, which I failed to do at the time, and thought to myself, that was a massive cover-up. And the reason why it's been a massive cover-up was because Walter Jackson more or less got away with Hillsborough first time round at the inquest and the subsequent inquiries by Lord Justice Stuart Taylor and Stuart Smith, with more or less his own reputation intact. He stayed in the organisation as Assistant Chief Constable up until 1995. I myself only joined the service in 1993. So Walter Jackson got away scot-free, basically. And it's inconceivable that somebody who behaved the way he did, when he was the most senior ranking officer in the day, that had to be covered up. Now, that cover up would have been manifested itself in every single officer who was in the police control box at that vital moment, and that would have been at least half a dozen officers. So this is a serious cover up. Now, I then alerted Margaret. I contacted Trevor Hicks, who lost two of his daughters, and Margaret Aspinall. Went to see Margaret Aspinall. I gave a statement to Margaret Aspinall with the account of Andy, my engagement with Andy Hymas, and then I was taxied to the Liverpool Echo by Margaret Aspinall. Spoke with the editor, who said he was going to publish that story in the Green One. He never did. For some reason, it got pulled, and nothing was heard of it for a while. But I still kept perceiving this as important. Now, when the independent police, when the independent panel came on board, I made soundings to the Independent Police Complaints Commission about what I had been told by Andy Hymas. We'd even been round to see Andy Hymas to see if he would give his story to the press or give his story direct to one of the family members, such as Trevor Hicks or Margaret Aspinall. Andy didn't want to know. He didn't deny it. He simply closed the door and said he was unhappy with me for disclosing the story he told me. Now, I then followed in the inquests quite closely, and when I then suddenly had an interesting dream that told me I had to get to the Hillsborough inquest this time round. This is the second inquest. I won't necessarily share the details of that dream, but it was when I was over in Ireland, and it was an astonishing dream. And I thought, I am going to the inquest. And I'd written out a more detailed statement now. And I went to see Trevor Hicks at the inquest this time round, the second inquest. Told him the story again, and told him how the statement I had given had got nowhere. But I'd made a fresh statement telling Trevor all the organisations I'd alerted to this vital piece of information concerning Andy Hymas and Walter Jackson. I'd sent this information to South Yorkshire Police. I'd sent this information to the police commissioner. I'd sent this information to the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and I'd stressed that it was vital importance to know the truth of what was happening at critical moments in the police control box. Never got a reply.
Sorry,
from any of them.
It's my understanding. Is it true that when you spoke to David Pidcock, he'd been told a similar story or the same story a number of years earlier? Is that correct?
Yeah, there was an interest. Yeah, because about the time of my employment tribunal in Sheffield, I joined the forces with Pidcock, and like yourselves, I was on a community radio station at Burngreave in Sheffield with a guy called Matt Lucan, who had an interest in Hillsborough because he'd been to the previous semi-final in 1988 and thought he'd never going to go over in Leppings Lane again because he nearly got crushed to death. And David Pidcock himself. And David Pidcock told me to honour, corroborated this story I was telling about Andy Hymas and Jackson on the Burngreave community radio station. David's story was that in 1989 he was on Radio Dubai abroad, and he interviewed Winton Cooper, who was a local BBC journalist at the time who'd been present in the ground in 1989, and David Pidcock was more or less echoing from the words of Winton Cooper that there was something very untoward that had happened in the control box concerning Walter Jackson. Now, let's be clear, Walter Jackson wasn't on duty initially. He was in the director's box. He had been responsible for the planning of the Hillsborough lead-up and had made the decision. He was instrumental in making the decisions to put Duckenfield in charge, right? An inexperienced match commander. Mm-hmm. So, David, in telling me this story of Winton Cooper, was more or less echoing the fact that there was news that Jackson was underneath the table as a gibbering wreck. So Jackson clearly had made his way at some point from the director's box. Well, he may have been drinking, and Winton Cooper suggested he had. I've got no evidence from Andy that he was drinking, but he made his way to the control box at a crucial moment, and the very fact that he was an assistant chief constable, he should have taken charge. Mm-hmm. He certainly shouldn't have been under the table interfering with the decision making, which obviously that had happened. So the interesting thing about Winton Cooper is that at the time we were blurting this out, and this would have been, I think, in 2011, news came through that Winton Cooper was murdered. Guess what date he was murdered?
Yeah,
15th of April. So Winton Cooper potentially had some information that could have blown the Hillsborough issue wide open. He gets murdered now. His son was charged. I think this happened in France or south of England. I'm not quite sure where the circumstances.
I think it was in Sussex or Surrey or somewhere like that. Sussex.
Yeah. But the murder happened on the 15th of April. I think, is it 2011 or 2010? I'm not quite sure which of those two dates. So that was Pidcock's slant on it. So Pidcock was certainly attuning himself to what I was saying about Andy Hymas. And it was Pidcock who knocked on the door of Andy Hymas to try and persuade him to see sense and come clean and clear his conscience. Now, just one other thing to mention about Andy Hymas and his role as a press officer. One of the things that is little understood, and I didn't appreciate this at the time, but all Andy's department got disciplined after 1989 concerning Hillsborough. And in fact, Andy's manager was sacked. Now, she later challenged in an employment tribunal, and there was a settlement, but she never returned back to the organisation. And Andy's subsequent manager explained to me what had happened, and she said that that would explain why Andy was subsequently so circumspect, right? Because obviously you speak truth to power in these circumstances, and at best you're going to end up losing your job and your pension. At worst, it could be something more sinister. So I think Andy was obviously, I suppose understandably, a little bit frightened of what he knew, and felt, for reasons probably best known to him, it best for him to keep quiet on the matter. And even 20 years later, when he knew about my dismissal and he knew the circumstances of why I'd been dismissed, he seemingly chose to keep quiet and not rock the boat when he could have been a vital witness. Now, I want to take you back to the inquest now, because I submitted a very detailed statement to the solicitor, the QC Peter Weatherby, who represented 22 of the families, including Trevor Hicks and Margaret Aspinall. And he took that statement and he then passed it on to the inquest team. This was before Jackson was called to give his evidence. And that was given to a guy called Tim Souter, who was part of that Hillsborough inquest team supporting the coroner Lord Justice Goldring. And Jackson, lo and behold, Jackson's called, I think in January 2015, and a ruling is made on Jackson. This is 77, and apparently the ruling was that because Jackson is suffering from depression and suffering from some symptoms of dementia, the ruling was that he was not to have, the questions could only be short and of a non-adversarial nature, which in effect meant that the issues that I've described as to what was happening in the police control box could not be raised against Jackson. So that was a cover-up. Andy Hymas, and I'd made a recommendation to the inquest team that Andy Hymas should be subpoenaed in order to give evidence, which was crucial. Obviously, Andy Hymas was never called by the inquest team. So I could only draw one conclusion on that simple fact alone, that the inquest team were hell-bent on covering up, still covering up the truth. They weren't interested in getting to the truth because this was absolutely essential evidence at the critical time. Are we?
We're fine.
We're fine. It's just the visual's gone a minute. So I'll carry on. So that decision by the inquest not to protect Jackson and to not allow any probative questioning concerning this was the final straw for me, that sort of I concluded, well, this is still a monstrous cover-up with Jackson. Now, I want to just mention the inquest team, and because it's quite enlightening if you look at who's who in the inquest team. I'm going to name a few people who were part of that inquest team and just give you a few hints. The lead assistant is Christina Lambert, and she's worked for Dame Janet Smith. And you know who Dame Janet Smith is? Well, she closed down my case, but more importantly than that, she was the one that presided over the Jimmy Savile investigations and more or less shut that down. And she also had the issue of the Shipman murders. So she's had her training from Dame Janet Smith. Jonathan Howe, the QC, well, he was in the inquest of Diana Dodiel fired, and that covered up, as well as the inquest of Jean-Charles de Menezes. You've got Tim Souter, I've already mentioned, who received all my witness statement. He's had a role in the inquest of the cover-up of the 7/7 and the Al Swedi affair, which is about the Iraqi prisoners. And the death of the second UN Secretary, Hammarskjöld. And then you've got another one, Oliver Clarion, who's also had 7/7 bombings involvement on their inquest. So this team is seemingly a hand-picked team that have previously got the track record of the most well-known cover-ups in recent years.
Cover-up team.
Draw your own conclusions from that. But you just look at the conduct of the inquest team in keeping Jackson protected, and you think, well, this is just another layer of obfuscation that allows the truth to be kept under wraps. Now, that context set, here's what I believe. I can't prove it, but I have got, if I put my principal intelligence hat on now, I have got reasonable cause to suspect, and this is the bombshell, that Hillsborough was deliberate. I'll say that again. I believe Hillsborough was deliberate.
But do you mean that it was the event was deliberate, or do you believe that they deliberately killed people?
No. I believe, and I was obviously going to elaborate on what I've just said because it's quite provocative and sensitive. It's quite a bold thing to say, but my conscience compels me to say it. I believe what happened is that South Yorkshire Police senior managers, we're talking at the assistant chief constable level and above, were probably all in cahoots with the government, the Thatcher government at the time, and various administrators in football. And they concocted a cunning plan, and that cunning plan was to allow a crush to happen at the Leppings Lane end at this semi-final. A semi-final that had been rehearsed a year previously, and they had all the intelligence in the world to tell that this was a disaster waiting to happen. They even had 8 years earlier with the Wolverhampton and Tottenham semi-final more intelligence to suggest that the Leppings Lane was a disaster waiting to happen. So I believe what was going on in the minds of South Yorkshire Police and the government is that they wanted all-seater stadiums across the top division in England, what was to be the Premiership division, because the stadiums they realised were out of date and a problem. So they had to have a reason to inject so much money at a time of austerity, and I think this was what they were permitted to happen. I don't think they bargained on it being the disaster it turned out to be. I think they probably bargained on half a dozen people being crushed and injured, going to hospital, to be an investigation, and that would allow a recommendation to take place to have ground improvements in all-seater stadiums. I don't believe for 1 minute that they thought it was going to be anywhere near as bad as it turned out to be.
Yeah.
I believe that there were only a few in on it, and those would have been people like Jackson, people like Hayes, people like Peter Wright, and of course a team in the government, and some people around the safety certificate and ground certificate at Hillsborough. Where it went wrong is that Jackson, obviously, I think was in on it, I don't think Duckenfield for one moment was.
No, do you think
Duckenfield was switched at the last minute.
Duckenfield's a strange one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you think he was set up?
Duckenfield, I think, was set up as the patsy who would not be in the know, who would actually have to make the decisions as an experienced match commander. And if he was ignorant of what the grand plan was, he could be left to sort of face the critics. Right? Obviously, as I say, I don't think they bargained on 96 people getting killed by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that would explain why Jackson, when he made his way, he would have been in on the plan, when he realised that this was worse than he'd ever imagined and was out of control, I believe that's why he became a gibbering wreck. I believe his conscience then at that point realised, shit, I'm in something really big here. I've been part of a plan. And I think he just went to pieces because he could see that there were fatalities. That was never the plan. It was just injuries. And I think because of that, that's why Jackson and the incident in the control room had to be covered up by everybody involved. And the government would need that covered up. Senior management of South Yorkshire Police would need that covered up. Because you imagine the consequences if what I'm saying is true, was actually exposed. Right? It's something that the government could never allow to sort of come out because they'd be implicated in murder, like those decision making. So this was a critical area that I believe they had to keep under wraps, and that's why all the strings were pulled to cover up Hillsborough, and not just at the time. And I don't need to go into all the details of all the cover-up that was happening. That would be raking up all ground. It's unnecessary. But also the subsequent cover-up by the inquest team. Now, yes, the families have been completely exonerated, and we can all be thankful for that. But they still haven't had justice because nobody has ever been brought to any prosecution whatsoever. And I haven't got a great deal of confidence. There's no confidence in the integrity of the Independent Police Complaints Commission. So until we see collars being felled over Hillsborough, then I don't, the whole thing will remain a bit of a curse on South Yorkshire Police and a shame and a disgrace for the nation.
What I wanted to bring up as well. You did mention earlier on when you were talking, Andy Hyman did Hymas, yeah, sorry. He said that there was ambulances already queued up outside Hillsborough, sort of 10, 15 minutes before kickoff. That's unusual, isn't it? I believe it is. There were. I mean, there's video evidence in the latest Daniel Gordon film. You can see all the ambulances outside the ground that never actually got inside the stadium. There was only one ambulance that I think entered the stadium. And for whatever reason, they were all parked up. They didn't arrive with the flashing lights coming in response to an emergency. They were already parked up. So it was almost as if they were planning. I think that's an indicator. It's not conclusive, but it's an indicator that something sinister was possibly being planned. The other thing to mention there are many things to mention, but the misprint of the ticket to the Leppings Lane end get to the ground by 2:45. Yeah.
Well, that was an atrocious misprint that would have been a causation factor.
I know personally on the back of those tickets as well, because I'm a Sheffield Wednesday supporter, so I go to Hillsborough quite a lot, and those tickets are pre-printed, and then whatever game it is printed on top. So that for that to happen, it's got to have been deliberate, because and for it to only happen in the Leppings Lane end as well. Is that my understanding correct? That's
right. Yeah. And I think the other thing, the lack of control outside the ground, and the switch of now. Brian Moe was the match commander at the previous semi-final and had a vast amount of experience.
Yeah.
And he was swapped at the 11th hour to somebody who had no experience whatsoever. Brian Mole was swapped under bizarre circumstances because his Hamilton Road district was in somewhat of a disgraceful situation regarding an incident with a young rookie police officer who'd been traumatised by his buddies, police officers, who had hoods over their heads, called him to an incident and tied him up and were about to bury him alive. And he completely freaked out. Now, officers were disciplined with that, but the outcome was that Brian Mole, who was the district commander of Hamilton Road and would have otherwise by default taken control of the Hillsborough game.
Which he'd done the previous year, hadn't he? He'd done that the previous year as well, and the previous year it was an identical semi-final, Nottingham Forest against Liverpool, and the fans had the same ends of the ground, but he'd put things into place, safety features into place at the Leppings Lane end, including several checkpoints, which Duckenfield never did the following year, did it?
Yeah, that's right.
And
I don't want to be overly critical on Duckenfield, other than his biggest mistake was to lie.
Yeah.
And he has to face the consequences to that. But he's a key witness, because he's been left to hang out now to dry, facing a verdict of unlawful killing. The establishment are likely to be quite happy and content to let him take the rap for all of this as much as possible, in order that they're protected. But I hope and pray that the story I've just told you is getting around in Liverpool. The families, by and large, I think all know of that story. I myself spoke to Trevor Hicks yesterday on the phone after speaking to you, Jason, and Trevor wants Jackson to be brought to justice. He knows about the incident. I haven't yet shared with Trevor my thoughts, because I want to do that in a meeting with him about it. I want to put to Trevor, consider the possibility that this was deliberate. And if you consider that possibility, it starts to make sense how they've covered it up. Better sense than if they've not covered it up and it was just an accident. All these daft things that South Yorkshire Police did on the day, right, are difficult to explain without considering the possibility that this was actually meant to be an accident. All right, not as bad as it turned out to be, but then once it had happened, obviously we all know about the steps that were taken to deflect the blame onto the Liverpool fans, and the 27-year cover-up, which we don't really need to go into. So I wanted to get that out. The one final point I want to make regarding Jackson. At the inquest, and this is important, at the inquest, it was admitted that Jackson failed, and everybody failed to invoke the code word that would bring in the major incident plan and an emergency response that might have got all those ambulances inside the stadium a lot sooner. That code word was the word catastrophe. That should have been called out very quickly over the airwaves when they were seeing people being crushed. There was a complete failure to call that code word, to invoke the major incident plan. Why was that? Well, quite frankly, Jackson was interfering with the decision making and was a gibbering idiot at the time that code word should have been called. But he didn't admit to his state of mind when that happened. Right?
And as a result, the ambulances never went onto the pitch, did they, to give the emergency aid? There was only one ambulance that went onto the pitch.
That's correct.
He did that. The ambulance driver of that did that off his own back. He wasn't ordered to. He just decided that he couldn't sit there no longer and went onto the pitch.
Yeah, and a substantial proportion of police officers were linking arms when people were sort of fighting for their lives outstretched on the pitch, and they were more concerned with putting the stupid cordon across the pitch. So daft things that were happening here. It was crazy. They were getting no direction from the control room. Right. So, but there's been no real probative inquiry that's delved into that vital, tale that's been told by Andy Hymas. It's so fundamental to what went on. And at the moment, everything that we've been told is almost certainly false, because they have not taken into account the effect that Jackson had with his behaviour on the day. Now, one final thing, when the recent Chief Constable, David Crompton, after the inquest verdict was announced of unlawful killing, what happened? Well, David Crompton faces the press outside Carbrook Hall headquarters and apologises. Now, interestingly, he uses the word, he apologises for and he says, we got it catastrophically wrong on the day. He's referring to the code word that wasn't called in code, in a way, the operation, the catastrophe. Now, what Crompton failed to do, which ultimately was probably the nail in his coffin, he didn't apologise for the cover-up of the last 27 years. He simply said, we got it wrong, and he didn't think Hillsborough could happen again. Right? So Crompton copped for it. He also copped for the fact that at the inquest, the conduct of the South Yorkshire Police legal team was less than edifying. And obviously, with all the lies that were being told and the conflicting tales of former police officers giving conflicting evidence, none of this was very edifying for the families who'd have to endure this suffering for the last 27 years. So whether it was from all ex-officers or not, none of this reflected well of South Yorkshire Police. Crompton took no steps whatsoever to steer South Yorkshire Police, past or present, to behave themselves at this inquest. It never happened. We got no leadership from Crompton, right? And Crompton did this in the full knowledge of Jackson. I've got correspondence on my website that clearly, shows that Jackson was, and the Jackson issue was known to Crompton. He can't deny he didn't know about it, but he sought simply to show willful blindness to it, as they have all done and continue to do, in the hope that it never comes out. But I think that there's a danger here that the Liverpool united over this and going for the jugular, as I think they want to do with South Yorkshire Police. They don't want to stop. They can see the corruption from top to bottom, not just in 1989, but it's enduring to present day. And there's no sign of it abating. And they are as united as a community in terms of, and are determined to smash it wide open. And I think with that close-knit community, it's half a chance. I think it will terrify the establishment, because if Hillsborough, the truth behind Hillsborough as I've related to you, if there's any essence of truth in what I've said, right, then it really is going to smash open the corruption within. And the Liverpool community are going to be hard to stop.
Absolutely. I've just wondered if you'd seen this latest story that's come out this morning. It's the police watchdog to investigate Hillsborough inquest spin claims. Now, it's
Haley Court.
Yeah.
There's a lady. Yeah. Again, this is another interesting one. So here we have. I know a little bit about this. That Haley Court is was in the same role that Andy Hymas was as a press officer.
Right.
And Haley Court is alleging, I believe, that when she was recruited not so long ago, that she was placed under pressure to put a positive spin when in her coverage of the inquest, and that she was asked to gather the press together and tell them what to write, right, and put her spin on it.
Yeah.
And it was part of her performance review that she spoke well and put the positive side of South Yorkshire Police, rather than necessarily putting down the truth as it was being reported in the inquest. Now, once again, we have South Yorkshire Police in denial about this. So they're saying there's no substantial evidence to support what Haley has suggested as a whistleblower has happened. So who do you believe? Do you believe Haley's making this up? Or do you believe South Yorkshire Police senior command team who are saying there's no substantiated evidence in any of this? And who does it get referred to? well, the other corrupt organisation, probably even more corrupt than South Yorkshire Police, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, who, yes, yeah, they'll investigate it, but it's just like an excuse for it going nowhere.
Yeah,
Does that more or less cover it as you see it, Jason?
She's saying that she was told that your job is to round up the media at the end of the day and tell them this is the line. And she was also told to the court said the line considered favourable by the force included evidence to spread blame away from its own failings, including allegations of misbehaviour against Liverpool supporters. So even all these years on, they're still trying to maintain this cover-up, even though it's common knowledge now.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary what South Yorkshire Police, how they behave. You think they might have learned the lessons, but seemingly they're not learning anything. And I don't know. I don't know whether this is deliberate. Now, another interesting angle on this, I think, is if you just move on slightly from Hillsborough and we look at Cliff Richard. Yeah.
Yep.
Because obviously, not so long ago, I mean, we had Cliff Richard's home raided, and involved with that was South Yorkshire. Central to that was South Yorkshire Police, David Crompton in particular, the communications department, led by a lady called, she's called Carrie Goodman, who was recruited by Crompton from West Yorkshire. And Carrie was had previous experience in association with the 7/7 bombings. So Carrie Goodman gets involved in, and a key local BBC correspondent called Dan Johnson. And the story of that is that Dan Johnson gets a leak that South Yorkshire Police are planning a raid on Cliff Richard. He gets that leak not from South Yorkshire Police, he gets it from Operation U-Tree, the Metropolitan Police. So with that leak, Dan Johnson confronts South Yorkshire Police, because he looks after Look North, and he's well used to sort of dealing with South Yorkshire Police on the newsworthy issues of the day. He threatens to expose the proposed raid if he's not let in on the finer details. So there's some then communications between Carrie Goodman and Dan Johnson, which then it all goes pear-shaped when the high-profile raid with helicopters causes outrage in the press, Cliff Richard, and then it brings in the Home Affairs Select Committee, and none other than the corrupt chair, Keith Vaz, who presides over a hearing, summons David Crompton and the BBC to the Home Affairs Select Committee on I think it was the 2nd of September 2014. And what was key here, again another state cover-up, is that one question absent is Vaz's complete refusal to ask the vital question. He probes South Yorkshire Police, but he doesn't probe where Dan Johnson gets his leak from in the first place. Right? That was a fundamental question. Who in Operation U-Tree leaked it to Dan Johnson? Because that was a breach. That was the most serious breach of all. Mm-hmm. But that was not of interest to the Home Affairs Select Committee. The Home Affairs Select Committee were interested in discrediting South Yorkshire Police. And all the scrutiny sort of focused on South Yorkshire Police. Now, why was that, one wonders? Well, you have to sort of think about, well, who benefited from the bungle raid on Cliff Richard's house? And I think what the outcome of that is that it's made investigations into high-profile celebrities that, where there's allegations of paedophilia and the likes. It's made it that much more difficult to invoke, for fear of being sued. Now, were South Yorkshire Police, right? What was their purpose? Bear in mind, South Yorkshire Police at the time were under heightened criticism for their role in the Rotherham child sexual exploitation issues, and we'll probably come on to that in a little while. And obviously the Hillsborough issues. So they're under a cloud, backs to the wall, and they suddenly come out with a very unusual, high-profile raid against somebody as famous as Cliff Richard, on the basis of a single allegation made by somebody back in 1985. So they act on that, but they don't act on all of the allegations that have been made in their own backyard in Rotherham in more recent times. So this bizarre event, stage-managed event, almost unfolds, and the blame for that lies squarely on South Yorkshire Police. Now, you've got to start to wonder why all this is happening, and you get a murky picture, undoubtedly so. But truth is stranger than fiction here, and I believe either South Yorkshire Police were in on the game, or South Yorkshire Police had deliberately been set up by the establishment to take further rap. And this brings me on now. I don't know which the answer is, but it brings me on to Rotherham.
Yeah.
Because just like Hillsborough, Rotherham, you've got another national disgrace here. South Yorkshire Police are clearly now sort of singled out as perhaps the most corrupt public organisation in the country. And we've got, with Rotherham, we've got a decade or more than a decade of cover-up where Asian groups have been grooming and have been allowed to get away with this with impunity. Mm-hmm. Knowing, and they would have only done this knowing that they were being protected by the police. There's clearly been some arrangement in place where they could do this, knowing the whole well that they would be protected. Something that tends to be sort of set aside, and that the blame, the reasons for the child sexual exploitation issues in Rotherham are attributed to what I think are bogus excuses, such as multiculturalism, fear of being politically incorrect. That's bullshit. That's rubbish, I believe. That's an excuse. I believe Rotherham was deliberately, like Hillsborough, allowed to happen as part of a deal between the government and the powers that be in South Yorkshire Police and maybe in Rotherham Metropolitan Borough Council. And why was that? Well, it's all part, when we can come back to the thing that I got sacked for in 2010, which was the terror threat. I stood up because I felt that Muslims were being demonised with a false narrative. 7/7 bombings, I couldn't believe, and I still don't believe to this day. I'm convinced it was an inside job. But why was that? Well, they're demonising Muslims. What are they doing in Rotherham? Well, they're demonising Muslims. Now, that's not to say that these groups of young lads, Asians, are not guilty. Of course they are. But why have they been allowed to carry on for decades unchecked? Right? It's got to have been part of a plan. And yes, it's been exposed now to a degree. But what's the effect of that? It's to heighten community tension, especially in places like Rotherham, and it serves the establishment to stereotype Muslim youngsters in much the same way as they've tried to stereotype the young jihadists who were Muslim ever since sort of the build-up to the London bombings. Now, just before we get on all to the intricate detail of Rotherham, I want to look at an event this week in Manchester.
Ah, right, okay.
Because we'll come back to the chart to Rotherham, but look at what's happened in Manchester earlier this week. There was a terror drill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, are you aware of that?
Yep. It was at the Trafford Centre, weren't it?
Again, yeah, the Trafford Centre, and the Greater Manchester Police are now sort of apologising because they one of their stooges who was in on the act sort of shouted out Allah Akbar, which is God is great, and just by doing that as part of the terror drill exercise, it's inferred that this was all done in the name of Islam, which is a narrative that they really do like to put out and have put out ever since 9/11, and certainly our government put out with events surrounding 7/7. And this is coming from Greater Manchester Police as part and parcel of a systematic programme of terror drills that are occurring up and down the country. Certainly, there's one planned for Merseyside, there's one being held in Essex, and there's been another one in Glasgow. So the government's false narrative of demonising Muslims, right, continues with the full support and backing of the police. And it's nothing short of evil what they're doing. Its effect is to sort of place in the mindset the fear that we are potentially under attack from ISIS. And often, a prelude to 7/7, for instance, was the terror drills that happened. Now, I just want to link this back to South Yorkshire Police again, because you wouldn't believe the extent to which South Yorkshire Police have been involved in this. And I want to name some officers in all of this false narrative that are demonising Muslims. And so I want to take you now back to 2005, and I want you to take you back to an individual, Chief Constable Meredith Hughes.
Right, sorry, Tony, we're just about getting up to an hour, where we usually take sort of like, before we get into anything, we go into any new areas. Perhaps it's a good time now we take a break, put a little record on, just have a chance to go and get a wee and a glass of water or something like that.
That'd be great, yeah, thank you.
Okay,
you
great.
Okay with that, Andy, yeah?
Yeah, we'll be back in just over 3 minutes.
You're listening to RaconteursNews.com. Stay tuned for more untwisted, unsweetened news. Please consider buying a t-shirt or making a donation to help support us. Thank you for your support. We do it for us all.
And welcome back to Raconteurs News this Tuesday evening. Pre-recorded on Friday morning. So it's Friday morning on Tuesday evening. Time travel on Raconteurs News. But we've got a great guest with us today, and we've had a very interesting first hour. And we'll see what the second hour is going to bring. I'll bring back Tony Farrell. How are you doing, Tony?
Fine, I've just managed to grab a cup of tea while the music was playing, so I'm happy now and I'm ready to continue.
Okay, then we'll let you go on from where we left off.
I was wanting to take the listeners back to 2005 and South Yorkshire Police's role in the bogus terror threat construct, which I think you need to look at this in the context of what's happened in Rotherham. So the terror threat construct is all about the demonisation of Muslims. Now, what happened? Why are South Yorkshire Police so involved? Well, the first individual is Meredith Hughes, the former Chief Constable that I've mentioned, previously with Hillsborough. Now, Meredith Hughes was instrumental in events surrounding 7/7. First of all, he was given the ACPO lead role in the G8 summit at Glen Eagles of the week of the 7/7 bombings. And many readers may not be aware that there was a bomb hoax, a bomb scare, with a massive police response led by Meredith Hughes in Glen Eagles on the 5th of July 2005, 2 days before the London bombings. On the same day, the 5th of July, there was a bomb scare in Meredith Hughes' backyard, not sort of 200 yards away from his office at Castle Market in Sheffield, right? So another bomb hoax on the 5th of July, right? Then there was the London bombings, and then there was a further bomb scare and then a major evacuation in Sheffield, which occurred on the 11th of July at Abbeyfield Park, where 8,000 people were evacuated as a result of a bomb scare. So this was South Yorkshire Police, and the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire Police, who was over at Glen Eagles, playing an instrumental part in the bogus terror threat construct that was pivotal around the 7/7 bombings, which were undoubtedly false flag operations, inside jobs committed by state apparatus rather than the 4 Muslim young lads, patsies, that have taken the blame with the narrative that has occurred by the government and stands today as what they perceive, what they would like the public to believe. So that's Meredith Hughes. Now, Meredith Hughes then, after 7/7 occurs, gets the job of the ACPO lead in the post-investigation of 7/7. So it's Meredith Hughes who gets that job. Now I want you to switch to the Chief Constable who's suspended, David Crompton. David Crompton, at the time of the London bombings, was in the senior command team at West Yorkshire Police, not South Yorkshire Police. And West Yorkshire Police covers Leeds, and in particular the area of Beeston. So now Beeston is significant because 3 of the 4 lads who were set up as patsies, who were recruited as MI5 assets, were basically came from that area. And what did Crompton do? Well, Crompton was involved in post 7/7 with the restoration of community relations that had broken down in Beeston as a result of the allegations made against the 3 patsies that came from Beeston, and all the investigative work by the police regarding the 7/7 bombings as originated from the area of Beeston. So Crompton had that role. Now both Crompton and Meredith Hughes, for their sins, received the Queen's Police Medal shortly afterwards, and
nice.
The CBE, the commander of the Excellent Order of the British Empire. You know, I think Meredith Hughes may have been granted that too for his sins. But that's not all, because I know when I discovered that my boss, when I was sacked 5 years later on, that my boss was part of a terror drill exercise in London on the very day itself of London bombings, and that was a DCI, a Detective Chief Inspector, Steve Williams, who blabbed, his name was Blubber, but he blabbed to me when I was raising Red Alert, that he was in this terror drill in London and heard it all come over the airwaves, and that he couldn't talk about it, right? Probably sworn to secrecy, but he shouldn't have blabbed to me, but he did. So there we have another involvement with South Yorkshire Police, and a 3rd officer, direct linkage with 7/7. Now I want to come on to, and this is why I mentioned Greater Manchester Police in previous, I want to mention an event that occurred in April 2004. And relating it with, this week we've had a bomb drill in Manchester, of which the police have had to apologise for the linking that exercise with Islam, right? And the police have had to do a bit of a climb down. But in April 2004, it's not too well known this, but it is fact, there was a bomb hoax surrounding Old Trafford. And it was to do with Iraqi Kurds who were arrested, but this was all fabricated, and they were all released without charge. But the Sun newspaper, Murdoch's Sun, and even the Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith, refused to sort of put an injunction on the Sun. And basically what went out to the public was that this was a real terror threat that happened when it clearly was an event simply initiated by the Greater Manchester Police, who subsequently refused to apologise when it was proven that there was absolutely no substance to what they were saying. Right? So yet again, we have an instance, and this was like the threat was coming from abroad, from this time, on this instance, Iraqi extremists, when it was all made up. and this was Greater Manchester. Now, who was in charge of the Trafford district at the time of that stunt? None other than the assistant that Meredith Hughes recruited to South Yorkshire Police, and the assistant chief constable that was in place that I should have been presenting to, Andy Holt. Now, Andy Holt was the district commander in charge of Trafford at the time that stunt was pulled. Andy Holt then came to South Yorkshire Police. So you've got track records here. Well, you're getting the picture here. There's at ACPO level, these senior officers are involved directly across the country in putting out this false narrative that has the effect of demonising Muslims unfairly, based on lies, based on falsehood, right? And they're part and parcel of that programme that's put out, right? And South Yorkshire Police senior commanders are playing an instrumental part in that. That there can be no doubt. So then you look at, well, now that you see that, if you see that pattern emerge, you can then start to see, from a slightly different vantage point, why they may have allowed Rotherham to occur deliberately.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Do you follow the logic?
Yes, yeah. It's all about demonisation
of the government machinery that's in place that wants to put out a narrative that creates the tension. And Rotherham, I believe, has been singled out as one area in the country where they are going to be quite happy to let hang out and dry and allow community tension to take place. Clearly, we've got all the demonstrations, United Against Fascism versus the English Defence League, all this that has been brewing, and it's cost, hundreds of thousands of pounds of extra policing costs at a time of austerity, creating havoc in Rotherham, doing untold damage to the business community, right? Doing nothing but create potential hatred between two communities. This is no accident. This is not something that the government, right, are against. The government are actually creating the conditions whereby this is occurring. And South Yorkshire Police, by allowing this element of child sexual abuse that was occurring underneath their noses that they were aware of, right, by allowing that to happen and allowing these youngsters to get away with impunity, to do this for so many years until it's all exposed and creates the kind of crisis that we have now, you've got to ask, what is the agenda? And there's talk now like the only solution for South Yorkshire Police is to disband them. They're discredited. Well, yes, they are discredited, but disband them into what? To merge into West Yorkshire, equally corrupt, complicit fully in the London bombings. And you only have to go to the Unprofessional Standards website of West Yorkshire Police to know how corrupt their ways are. So they're likely to take control of South Yorkshire Police under the rebranding, right? If that disbanding does indeed happen.
Well, just a thought here, Tony. Something I've noticed, a lot of things are tried out in Scotland before they're brought into England, and I notice in Scotland now they have a national police force. Do you think that's what they're aiming for here?
I think that's a component part that to in the first instance, regionalise police forces. I mean, there's some logic in regionalisation of police forces for economies of scale savings. Mm-hmm. But whether that regionalisation then leads to a national police force where they've got full control, I think we are heading that way. And if viewers haven't already seen it, I would recommend them to search out the American film called Grey State. Have you heard of that?
I think I've heard of it. I've not seen it though.
It's it's a very stark, shocking, but extremely well made video documentary of the police state that's happening in America. Now, the producer of that film is dead now. He was only young, and he died in very suspicious circumstances. But that film is available, and I would urge viewers to look at that, because and I sent details of this to David Crompton, imploring him to watch this film. And I did that because I once had the opportunity, while I was outside the force, to listen to David Crompton in an evening of conviviality where he spoke, and his subject he was speaking in a pub in Sheffield was about restoring public trust and eradicating corruption within the police service. So a convivial chief constable, relatively new to South Yorkshire Police, was making quite a few nice sound bites, but he wasn't really walking his talk. And but I found it interesting, and of course I wanted to alert him to what is perceived to be going on in America, that seems to be a pattern that the UK police forces are beginning to follow now. And if you start to stand back and look at all these bogus terror threats, what's happening in Rotherham, the tension on the great community tension that's on the streets in Rotherham, and you start to see that the conditions are right for the police state to be implemented, which goes completely against what Crompton was actually saying in his speech. He did not want a police state, but that was the message he was giving to the public. But is it really the truth? Is he being genuine when he says that? I suspect not. I really have lost all faith in and trust in the integrity of our police forces in the United Kingdom. Not one senior ACPO officer has ever come out and spoken against the fact that 7/7 and the likes are actually bogus constructs. And until police start to senior police officers, ACPO level, start to whistleblow, then we're never going to get to the truth. The one that perhaps did whistleblow died, and that was Michael Todd, and he died at the foot of Snowdon in very suspicious circumstances.
Yeah, they're interesting that. Wasn't he Greater Manchester?
He was Greater Manchester, and he was a danger to the establishment. And I've heard many good reports that he was trying to expose corruption, and his particular portfolio was to do with rendition and the detainees issues. And he was a danger to the establishment. He was also a danger because he was exposing a lot of police criminal networks in the CID in Greater Manchester, and therefore he had made a lot of enemies. But his death was attributed to a suicide brought about by the uncovering of an affair he was having. Believe what you will, I don't think that stacks up. I think he was. He kind of met the same fate that David Kelly did.
Yeah, very interesting.
And I remember my very first communication with David Crompton was to alert him to a very good report I'd dropped upon about Greater Manchester Police and Michael Todd, of which Crompton read it and thanked me for actually sending it to him, because I think, let's be abundantly clear here. To be a chief constable, if you are going to expose things, you are going to have to go into the lion's den and put your life in danger, because you'll know things that could topple governments. Right? So we need brave chief constables, but at the moment I don't think there is one brave chief constable around. I don't think there's one brave ACPO officer around. I think they're all cowards, and they're all towing the government line and the false narrative. My hope, I think, for South Yorkshire Police has always been that because they're an Achilles heel, they offer an opportunity to strike back and bring the house down on wider elements of corruption. But they have to sort of turn the full circle if they want to do that. But they are potentially very dangerous to the establishment, because with backs to the wall, they know a lot. They could bring the truth out on many things. And there's enough officers inside that probably are in the know to do that, but are all keeping quiet. My hope is that maybe because the back's against the wall, truth does come out and we get a load of whistleblowers come forward, and it really does bring the house down.
Do you think South Yorkshire Police, the way that they're acting at the moment, there are so many stories of them making mistakes, doing things, such as recently we've had the Ben Needham case as it's come up again, and some officers have gone over to the I can't remember which one it was, which island it was. But they've gone over to the island where he disappeared to try to ask for more information, see if anybody knows anything, and they've been pictured on the piss, basically, and that's all they've been doing.
You've also got the helicopter incident, haven't you? That they've been using the Force helicopter to spy.
To spy on people having sex. Yeah, in fact, there's officers that are actually on trial at the moment for that, aren't there?
Yeah. Well,
so do you think that it's do you think it's arrogance on their part? Because I mean, even with this latest thing with the press officer that's come out, the Haley Court stuff, it just seems that that they're either really, really arrogant or they're doing it on purpose, and they want South Yorkshire Police to fail and be disbanded and replaced with whatever they decide. What do you think it is?
Right, I'm going to say something that will shock readers now in response to this question, and I'm going to bring in a completely different dimension to it, if I may.
Okay.
On my website, Jar Talk, under the Chronicles of Crompton, there is a series of correspondence that I've had with David Crompton publicised. And I want to draw on that web page. There's a letter that isn't. There's one letter that it isn't from me, but it's from Muad'Dib, the 7/7 Effect filmmaker. This film was part and parcel of the thing that woke me up to the truth behind the 7/7 bombings. But Muad'Dib can be seen to write a letter to David Crompton, and I think that letter is of the utmost importance, and I would encourage your listeners to visit Jar Talk and go to the Chronicles of Crompton page and download the document which is headed The Best Advice on Earth, which is authored by Muad'Dib, Jar. And Jar writes to Crompton, right? And he writes to Crompton saying that the curse of God is put on South Yorkshire Police because of Walter Jackson. And that more and more bad things are going to happen to South Yorkshire Police until they do what Jar asked them to do. Now, that takes a little bit of explaining, but viewers will need to, listeners, I urge to go to that website and read that correspondence. But in a nutshell, Jar was Muad'Dib. Many readers will know that he did time in prison because of the 7/7 bombings and send in a DVD to help in a case help get to the truth of three Muslims who were associated with the four patsies that didn't do 7/7 and were facing lifetime imprisonment. Muad'Dib sent his video 7/7 Ripple Effect to the courts in an appropriate way as an amicus curiae brief, perfectly lawful, but instead got extradited and thrown into prison because of that until he was released by a jury. But he spent 157 days in prison. Before that even, he was imprisoned by a false allegation of threat to kill, which involved Walter Jackson. And that happened in 1986, when Walter Jackson refused to put right a wrong. And from that moment on, he made an enemy of Muad'Dib. Now, Muad'Dib then writes in, I think it was October 2014, he writes to David Crompton about Walter Jackson. And he writes about Hillsborough and the cover-up of Walter Jackson in the control room. But he also makes direct reference to Walter Jackson bringing down a curse of God on South Yorkshire Police. And that the only way of South Yorkshire Police lifting that curse is for Crompton or the Chief Constable to meet with Muad'Dib, Jar, and actually start to do the right thing, something that they clearly are not doing at the moment. And that, I would urge viewers to read that open public letter in order to start to get an appreciation of the importance of what I'm saying here. Make no mistake, this is the most important advice South Yorkshire Police have ever had, but they've never acted on it. So you ask me, why is all this happening to South Yorkshire Police? I've said that read the best advice on earth, the letter that Jar gave to David Crompton, that Crompton ignored. You look at what's happened to South Yorkshire Police, you look at what's happened to Crompton, right? You need to understand what Jar is about. And then you can start to understand what's happening to South Yorkshire Police. And then you can start to understand the strategic importance of the city of Sheffield is in world affairs at the moment. Now, most people will be totally oblivious to that. It's not part and parcel of the remit of this session to go into all the details of why I'm saying that. I would urge all listeners to do their own investigation and start with accessing the letter that Jar made to David Crompton called The Best Advice on Earth and take it to there. And that's on the Jar Talk website, where there's a wealth of material on South Yorkshire Police and on Jar and on why he is saying, precisely why he's saying this to the senior command team of South Yorkshire Police. So if you look at why they're in the crisis, why they hung out to dry, why they keep on committing all these calamitous mistakes, is it all deliberate? No. I think it's just the way it is, and they've been found out, and they are now singled out, and I've always felt that they're an Achilles heel that could ultimately bring the house down. Crompton, when he first came in, was brazen enough to announce that he wanted South Yorkshire Police to be the best force in the country. I'm going to say something that surprises you. I believe they could still do that almost overnight. They could become the best force in the country if they started to tell the truth and expose the corruption, not just within their own ranks and files, but also the corruptions that they know exists above, and bring down the political establishment. Right? They could still do that. And if they did that, to some extent, what they've done in the last 10 years, 10, 15, 20, 27 years, would be exonerated, because they could, at one fell swoop, bring down the corruption within if they started to break ranks and tell the truth. And why should they be left to hang out and dry as the pariah police forces in the country? Maybe there's some good people still left in South Yorkshire Police at senior level. Maybe if they start to listen to this, they may well take action. But don't underestimate what Jar is saying in that letter. So I don't want to say too much more on that. I just urge listeners to do your own research and follow the lead that was given in that letter.
What do you think the impact of Orgreave is going to be? Do you think that Orgreave is going to turn into another Hillsborough? Because that seems to be a fire that's starting to burn a little bit more powerfully, shall we say?
Well, I think the first thing I want to say about Orgreave is the person that's done most to help that is a person I've already mentioned, which is Dan Johnson, the local BBC correspondent that was central to the Cliff Richard raid and South Yorkshire Police. And Dan Johnson made the Orgreave video, which was an award-winning video not so long ago, that was presented on the BBC, which painted a bad picture against South Yorkshire, going back to the days of 1984 when the Battle of Orgreave took place. And yes, I think Orgreave may well be able to coattail on the back of the success of the community of Liverpool in getting partly to the truth of Hillsborough. The truth certainly hasn't come out about Orgreave. There was a culture of cover-up in the 80s, right the way through the 80s decade. Similar managers, that has all been covered up, Orgreave. And yes, I have no doubt that the Hillsborough issue may well galvanise the communities in Barnsley, Rotherham, South Yorkshire, the mining communities that are seeing what's happening, seeing South Yorkshire Police down on their knees, and they will see an opportunity to go for justice in much the same way as the Hillsborough families did perhaps 5-10 years ago. And who knows where that will take us. Orgreave wasn't the disaster in terms of fatalities that Hillsborough was,
no.
But nevertheless, it was a stark example of the extent to which police would go to cover up the truth and corrupt all the evidence that they're entrusted with.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like it's a long, rocky road ahead for South Yorkshire Police, and perhaps the kindest thing would be to put them out of the misery. But then again, we really need these senior officers that are culpable, that are covering up what the truth and have been for a number of years. We certainly need to to see some bodies going into prison, but they've got time on the side, and a lot of. As you've already mentioned, some of the officers or some of the people involved now have dementia, in inverted commas, which the old what's his name? Who was the one who had dementia?
Walter Jackson.
Guinness.
Guinness?
Yeah.
No, I'm talking about the recent one who died. He were a lord.
Janner.
Janner, that's it. Yeah, Lord Janner. It's the Janner defence. A lot of them are going to be using the Janner defence. I think you already mentioned somebody at the inquest who wasn't allowed to have complex questions asked.
That's Jackson,
yeah.
The key person.
Yeah, so it's the Janner and Jackson defence is the dementia. So, but it is a long, rocky road ahead for South Yorkshire Police. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I think the point I want to make is the importance of the role of the police commissioner.
Okay.
Right? The police commissioners have been brought in and they're elected, and the police commissioners can hire and fire the chief constables. Right? We've not seen that happen very much, but what we have seen in South Yorkshire Police recently is Dr. Alan Billings, who was elected after the demise of Sean Wright over Rotherham. Billings being an educated individual, member of the Anglican priesthood, a former deputy council leader in Sheffield City Council, eventually under pressure suspends Crompton, which is perhaps the most radical decision he's made in the days prior to the recent election of the new round of police commissioners. And I had the opportunity while I was doing a whistle-stop tour to go to the Rotherham's hustling event where there was a debate by the candidate police commissioners in the days prior to the election. So there were 5 of them and Billings himself, and I got an opportunity in this group that was predominantly Muslim in the audience to ask a number of questions, and I told them the story about Jackson and the Hillsborough cover-up in the control room, and Billings, for instance, who's been commissioner for for over a year, claimed it before the audience that he didn't know that story. Well, if he didn't know that story, I've certainly written to his office on numerous occasions telling him that story and much more besides, and he was claiming not to know a thing about it. I got the impression he was actually telling the truth. Now I want to mention one of the other candidates, which was a guy from the UKIP, Gavin Felton. I think this is quite interesting because Gavin Felton is somebody with a little bit of a different profile. He served as a soldier. He was a sergeant major, and he's worked in the army in Rwanda, in Kosovo, and he served in the war in Iraq. An interesting debate ensued, in which Dr. Billings was poking a little bit of fun and about the duplicity of Gavin Felton for actually being a soldier in Iraq. Now that was red rag to a bull to Gavin Felton, because he then explained, and he said it was a very powerful testimony, this, that when he joined the forces and when he went to war in Iraq, they were searching genuinely for or they thought, for weapons of mass destruction. And he spent his time in Iraq, devastating that country, only to discover, a bit like I did when I woke up to the 7/7 bombings, that it was all based on a lie. And that's when he came out affected by, the lies of the government, the lies of the wars and this bogus war on terror. And he put Dr. Billings in his place, well and truly, with this powerful testimony as to how the war had affected him, and how it had actually compelled him to try and search for the truth, come what may, without any compromise. So a clearly defined black and white position by Gavin Felton seemed to be emerging, which is an unusual trait in the current breed of spineless politicians which run this country from top to bottom. So I felt that we might have a difference here with somebody like Gavin, but he came second. He didn't win, and Billings is restored as the police commissioner. But interestingly, I'll share this with you, because I had a conversation the day before yesterday with Gavin Felton, and I'm not political. I don't vote for any parties, but I did see something in Gavin Felton that gave me cause for optimism. So he met with me, and he shared with me one or two things that I think are quite interesting. But he believes that somebody like Billings, who has the control to hire and fire, is surrounded in his office by officers who are completely in allegiance with the senior command team of South Yorkshire Police and not supporting properly the police commissioner. He even went so far as to actually mention alleged incestuous relationships between the new Chief Constable, Dave Jones, who's temporarily put in place as the second Chief Constable. The one that replaced Crompton first time lasted less than 24 hours, Dawn Copley, because she's under investigation for corruption in Greater Manchester Police. So they had to bring somebody else in from North Yorkshire Police, Dave Jones. And he's having, lo and behold, the allegation is he's having a relationship with somebody in the police commissioner's office. Right? So there's all sorts of issues concerning a role of a police commissioner, because they're in a very powerful position, but they're also in a very vulnerable position. If an office is corrupt, a police commissioner is elected into an office that's corrupt, and it would, believe you me, I used to serve as a principal intelligence analyst. Now you'd think as a principal intelligence analyst you'd be cited on an awful lot of information, but you are sheltered, you're shielded. The organisation will only allow a principal intelligence analyst what they think the principal intelligence analyst needs to know, and it's they that determine what a principal analyst would see. Likewise with a commissioner, there is a shield around, so that the police commissioner only gets to see what the police want the police commissioner to see. And I think so my letters direct to Billings are being intercepted, so Billings isn't necessarily getting information on some of the wider truth perspectives that he should get, right? And I believe Billings, to that extent, was quite genuine. But it just goes to show you that, yes, it's a powerful role, and if you get the right people in that role, they can turn a police role, they can potentially turn the police force around. But don't underestimate the difficulties that they'll be confronted with, because they'll be surrounded by a team that are hell-bent on protecting the integrity of the police force, its reputation management, and any commissioner has to overcome that challenge. Really, the only way of doing that is to start with a clean sheet and get a new team in, and not run with a former team that's known that it's covered up and corruption and obfuscation. So I wanted to make that point, just to so that viewers get an appreciation of the difficulties that officers might face that may have a desire to break in and break open the layers of corruption that exist within police forces in the United Kingdom. It's not going to be easy. You need brave souls who clearly see black and white and will not compromise on truth.
Something we've seen recently, Tony, is that recent elections we've had appear to be very clearly rigged. You know, a classic example being the last general selection, where everybody's looking at each other and saying, "Did you vote Tory?" Nobody I've ever come across has admitted to voting Tory, apart from the woman on a Question Time who voted Tory because she thought they'd screw people over, except for her. And surely that's got to be the same with the police and crime commissioners. That you're only ever going to get people selected who are tame to the establishment. No one's ever going to get voted into that office, in my opinion, who is ever going to challenge the establishment and the kind of corruption that we're talking about here, Tony. How do you feel about that?
Well, I've got no first-hand experience of it, but I will relate. Now that you've raised this subject, I can only relate a story that Gavin Felton shared with me a couple of days ago, because he was there on election night. He came second. I think I don't remember the exact figures, but Billings ended up with something like, I don't know, was it 140,000? Don't quote me on it, but it was a substantial number. And the next, Gavin Felton from UKIP was something of the order of 50,000 votes, and he was a good second. And then there was the other three candidates that were more or less on a par, with 10,000 less or 20,000 less than the second place one. But Gavin, on the count, made it clear to me, at least, that he thought it was rigged. He was deeply alarmed by what he saw on the evening of the count, both in terms of the election papers and how they were managed, and also by the relationship that seemed to be in evidence between the current police commissioner from Labour, Dr. Billings, and the senior command team in South Yorkshire Police that were present on the night. Now, regarding the rigging allegation, Gavin said to me he was deeply suspicious, because at the time of the count, where he should have seen all the papers stacked and ready to be counted, there were two piles that he was looking at. He was looking at Alan Billings's pile, and the adjacent table was his own pile. And from his observation, he could see a difference of what he thought would have been around about 200, 300, as best guess, in favour of Billings, but it was quite close. And that should have been the definitive pile. He then think, well, I'm not going to, on that basis, I'm going to be short of a close second. He comes back a couple of hours later, and there's another pile laid on top of Billings's, and he couldn't for the life of me understand how that has happened, and was deeply suspicious that an extra pile after the cut-off point had been placed on Billings's. Now, Billings won by a considerable margin, but he's all as I can say is he was deeply suspicious with that. Now, I can't verify any of that. This is what Gavin told me. But I actually do trust the integrity a bit more of Gavin than I would do of any of the others. As I say, I mentioned his testimony of fighting in the Iraq War, and I followed the election with close interest, listened to all the debates, and he got stronger as time went on, and I felt as though he was potentially a threat. So they probably wanted Billings in as a safe bet. Now, whether it was rigged or not, I wouldn't like to say, but Gavin Felton certainly suspects that some foul play could have been at work. I can't really say any more than that.
Yeah, well, looking at recent elections, like Andy said, the last general election, and also the Scottish referendum as well. That's highly suspicious that they voted to stay with the UK, and then a year later the vote is completely collapsed, and it's all Scottish nationalists. So it just doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem to make sense. we're down to sort of like our last 15 minutes or so now. You did say beforehand that perhaps you'd like to clarify your position on with 7, isn't it? Clarify.
Oh yes, yeah.
Your position on 7. I thought we've got 15 minutes left. And you did bring this up beforehand, so I thought we'd give this last 15 minutes to do that.
Well, it probably won't take 15 minutes, but you mentioned at the start in your introduction that I've not been on the radar much. I've not been given too many interviews of late. I've been doing other work in Ireland, working with JAR, but around 2011, 2012, that time, 2013, I did a voluntary piece of work to support a black lady called Charles Seven, who had a interesting case, and I believe you mentioned that you've covered her on the interview. Now, Seven's case is a very unusual one. It's a case of intellectual property and allegations of widespread court corruption and a phenomenal episode that's endured for over a decade of gang stalking. Now, I have spent 6 months looking at the files of Miss Seven, the court files, and spending time prizing out of her exactly what happened over the last 15 years in her case. And it's all this is well documented in the Farrell report, which came out, launched by the UK column a few years ago. I myself witnessed firsthand some of the gang stalking that was occurring on Miss Seven as a result of getting involved myself in the report writing, and there's some extraordinary things that happened there. I stand by my support for Miss Seven completely in her allegations of widespread court corruption. I don't want to go into all the details. It's not, to do justice to that, you'd need another show. But suffice to say, I'm convinced that Seven had one case of intellectual property theft that should have given her a compensation and should have brought some high-profile celebrities in the judicial and the legal system and the media industry to criminal proceedings. That never happened. We had a judge that got promoted as a result and then got knighted and then got whacked, probably. And you had all sorts of shady dealings with judges, some of which, in the chain of judges that looked at Seven's case, were actually head of the Intelligence Security Committee services. So there's all sorts of issues. Now, one issue as well that complicated this is the link that Seven claimed to have in her case with the 7/7 bombings. And this is where perhaps I wanted to clarify my position, because Seven who has endured gang stalking since 2003 to present, and it's still ongoing, was somebody who alerted the authorities to the prospect of a terrorist attack occurring in London before it did. She could see clues that nobody else would dream of seeing, and there's evidence to suggest that she did her level best to alert the police and alert the judicial system in the magistrates court that they were going to do something terrible in July 2005. She then endured a wide range of stalking with all sorts of circumstantial signs, which persuaded her to believe that they were doing 7/7 connected with her. Now, she's probably overstated this, in my opinion, and said they've done 7/7 because of her. Well, I've never said that's the case. I don't share that opinion. I believe the London bombings would have happened irrespective of Seven. I think what the link is, and this needs to be understood because I think there's a lot of confusion there. I don't subscribe to the fact that 7/7 was done because of Miss Seven. Far from it. I believe Miss Seven was caught up in it because the people that scammed her were part of the planning team that had to actually pull off the London bombings, and used Miss Seven as an exquisite torment, and built some of the tactical decision making around her in some respect. I think she was intended to get nobbled as part of the attack. She seemed to protect herself by going indoors and barricading inside. But there were all sorts of connections. None of this, however, persuades me that they did 7/7 because of her. Far from it. I believe they may have made one or two decisions with her in mind, right, as part of an extension of an exquisite torment. And why do I say that? Because, well, one or two of the people that initially scammed Miss Seven have got track records of involved in the media industry and involved in false flag operations. And I want to just name one here. When Seven first got her concept stolen in 2003, the three individuals she met were Helen Alexander, Richard J. Hanna, and importantly, a guy called Jim Manson from Scottish Media Group. Jim Manson's the name that is key here, because here's another false flag operation that happened at Glasgow I think sometime after the London bombings, just in the lead up of Christmas. This was the terrorist attack that occurred at the Glasgow airport. Mm-hmm. And who should be the first person on the scene that witnesses it all happening? None other than this guy from Scottish Media Group who'd stolen Seven's work, Jim Manson. So I think the indicators are that this group that stole Seven's concepts was somehow that coincided with the people will recollect, perhaps, if they studied 7/7, the BBC Panorama programme in May 2004, which was the dress rehearsal for what they were going to do in July 2005. The 3 underground explosions and the overground explosion which happened on the bus. Well, that was all spelled out in full detail by the BBC's Panorama programme with Michael Portillo, Gavin Hessler and Crispin Black and a load of other stooges that were actually stage managing what they were going to do and advertising it hidden in plain sight. Now, Manson was part of the media group. I believe he was MI5. I believe he was part and parcel of the planning. And I believe because they'd scammed and made a fortune from lifting Seven's concepts and turning them into marketable TV programs that did the rounds all over the globe, they took great delight in tormenting the living daylights out of Seven, who was fighting back in a court case. And that court case became more and more dangerous to them. And therefore it intensified the gang stalking, and the crescendo reached around the month of July 2005. And I think that Seven got caught up in all of that. She has a name, like Seven. She has a family name, Jean Charles. You know, we had the assassination of Jean Charles de Menzies on the 22nd of July. And we have lots of incidences of strange things happening to Seven by the authorities around that time. I myself spent 3 months working on Seven's report in her own flat, and I will witness firsthand that across the road from her flat was a full corridor on the 3rd floor of the hotel in Gloucester Road, where they were devoted on zooming in open brazen surveillance on my kitchen window as I was writing that report. They were making no designs to hide it. This was brazen. They were letting me know that they're watching my every move. They were holding the radio antennae out the window to say, look, we're listening to you. They were following me every time I went around the Serpentine and went for a walk in Hyde Park. And they were trying to spook me so that I would walk away from it, which I never did. And then when that case became exposed on the UK column, lo and behold, within a week, that whole of that observation in that hotel on that floor, and we're talking must have been about 6 rooms, all zoomed in on Seven's kitchen window, all got subjected to a fire, where there were 125 fire engines, and the whole floor got burnt to the ground. that occurred on the exact same day that advertisements went out all over the London ground, over the underground in London, about a new stage production of the Strictly Come Dancing show, which was called Burn the Floor. And then so that and Strictly Come Dancing was one of the formats as we know it now that's made, gone around the world and made a fortune, that Seven actually put in place. It was her idea to have the current format taken from the old outdated Come Dancing. Right? Come Dancing wasn't hers, but this revolutionary new format, Strictly Come Dancing, was hers. And she should have got some kind of reward for that. So there we have an instance whereby I witnessed firsthand the level of stalking that was occurred with Seven, and that's endures to the day. And even just to rub it in with Seven, once they burnt the floor down of the corridor, the reconstruction company they got in all had liveried vans saying 777 on the side. They are using her for some reason as an exquisite torment as part of a gang stalking program. That I have no doubt. But just to clarify my position, I do not believe the London bombings were carried out because of Seven. They were carried out to demonise Muslims. And people shouldn't confuse the two.
Yeah. Well, we are coming up to the end of the show. It's almost been 2 hours. It's flown by. Thank you very much, Tony, for joining us. Is there, before we go, is there any links you'd like to give out or any websites about your work and where people can read up on the things that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I've already mentioned the Jar Talk website and in particular the Chronicles of Crompton webpage. I'd urge viewers to visit that and get a feel for my history of correspondence with South Yorkshire Police, and in particular read The Best Advice on Earth, which is not my letter, that's Letter of Jar. From there, take it for where they will. The other website I have, which covers Hillsborough in more detail, and a whole host of other things, is the Farrell Report. And the third website I'd like to invite listeners to look at is the website of Jar, Muad'Dib, and that's the Jar Truth website, which is a website with phenomenal information on. And I would urge viewers listening to this who feel as though there's some merit and truth to what I'm saying to also take a look at jartruth.net, which isn't my website, it's Jar's, but I would urge them to have a look at that. I think that's all really in the 2 hours I'd like to say. Obviously, you guys, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about South Yorkshire Police. I don't get any pleasure from talking about South Yorkshire Police because I worked for that organisation for 17 years, and it's sad to see their demise. It's sad to see them labelled as the corruption capital, and the most corrupt organisation in the country at the moment. But if I had an appeal to existing officers who are working for South Yorkshire Police, it would be this: come clean, start to tell the truth, start to expose the corruption within that they know about. We've got to get the police to turn, right? And I hope that the pressure that Liverpool community can exert will do that. So thanks very much, guys. Okay, I hope that's all right.
Thank you, Tony. Well, let's just hope that some people do follow your lead and do start to blow the whistle on what clearly is something that's not doing any service whatsoever for anybody. And that, I think, is just about it. Andy, do you want to finish us off?
Yeah, that's brilliant, mate. Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you, Tony. It's been very enlightening, and just like to say I hope you've all enjoyed this. Thank you very much for listening, because without you, we'd be just talking to ourselves. We'll be back at the usual time of 7 p.m. on Thursday night, and we'll be followed at 9 o'clock by the one and only Dr. Rock with Dr. Rock's radio show. Thanks very much, and good night.
Cheers.